Hello, greetings from Basel in Switzerland to you wherever you are who see and hear these sermons. We're in a series of sermons on the book of Acts, and we're in chapter 27, the second half. In the first half, Paul is on ship with Luke going to Rome from Caesarea to stand trial before Caesar, and they came into a great storm. And at the end of the passage of last time, which is verse 20, it says, all hope of being saved was taken away from them. So they're in despair, and then there's this terrible storm. So we'll continue in verse 21, and we'll have the actual shipwreck, the famous shipwreck of St. Paul. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, now, there were 276 people on the ship, and so Paul would not have stood up in front of all of them and spoken because the storm would have been too loud. They couldn't possibly hear him. So it must mean that he stood up before the leaders to whom he had spoken in the beginning of the chapter and warned them not to sail. And he was on very friendly terms with the centurion and was one of the in crowd of leaders somehow because he was a Roman citizen and he was going to trial before Caesar, and he was accepted as one of the leaders. So he would have had credibility. And he said to them, men, the Greek actually says gentlemen, so they weren't the prisoners or the slaves. You should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. Now, at first reading, it seems like Paul is saying, I told you so, but his motives are a little better than that. He wants them to realize that his advice to them is credible and was correct and true. And then in a couple of verses, we're going to see that he wants them to realize that it's not his advice, it came from God. And so he wants to say, I gave you advice 2 weeks ago, and you didn't accept it, but it turned out to be good advice and true. And now I'm going to give you more advice, and I'm encouraging you to accept it because it's clear that the advice I gave you before was true and good. And also, the advice comes from God, and I don't only want you to trust me, I want you to trust God and belong to him and worship him. So his motives are encouraging and evangelistic to say this. Verse 22, now I urge you to keep up your courage. And he has credibility to encourage them because his advice is good. Because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. Now, if they believed what Paul said, they would have been greatly encouraged, and this encouragement would have spread through the whole ship, which was what Paul wanted. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So they're in the middle of the Mediterranean, and it's been dark. They haven't been able to see the stars. They can't see very far from the ship during the day because of the gray and the clouds and the waves and the wind. So they don't know where they are. Verse 27, on the 14th night, this is Luke writing, so he's including himself, we were still being driven across the Adriatic. Now, it wasn't really the Adriatic, it was the middle of the Mediterranean. When about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. The Greek word that's translated approaching is actually resounding. So it means they heard the waves breaking on the shore, and that sound to their very sensitive ears showed them that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks. Now, the rocks is not exactly accurate because they didn't know if there were rocks there or not, but if there were some rocks, that the ship would be crashed against the rocks. They dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. The anchors were not very big, so they needed to put more than one. And when the daylight came, they would at least be able to see what was in front of them, if it was rocks or a sandy beach or where they were headed, and be able to take some action to not just be the victim of the storm. Verse 30, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. So it wouldn't have been all the sailors, but it would have been some that thought they could get away by going on this lifeboat. Actually, they couldn't have. It was a terrible storm, and it would have been suicidal to do that. Then Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. I see Paul is taking a leadership role, and he really wants to encourage the people. He really wants the people to be saved, and now he wants them to have the energy to swim. So they've been in this horrible storm, probably below decks for a large part, in total darkness, completely despairing and with tremendous anxiety, and of course no appetite. You don't think of eating in such a situation, and much of the food would have been spoiled by seawater anyway. So Paul has the motive to encourage the people and to point them to God so that they will trust God as he trusts God. Luke has the motivation of showing in this document that Paul works to save the Roman ship and works with the centurion and is accepted as a leader by the centurion, which will be very good evidence in his trial. And because this evidence is so positive about Paul, that he is a friend of Rome, that he serves the empire, that he cooperates with the centurion and the soldiers, I assume that he was not found guilty in Rome. And although we don't have any documentation, that he went on to Spain as God had said. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he had said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. This breaking the bread would have been Jewish, a typical Jewish way of giving thanks to God and breaking the bread, as we saw Jesus do in Emmaus with the 2 disciples. But it also would have been Christian, following the Last Supper, the breaking of the bread, which is how Luke describes communion. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board, soldiers, sailors, the owner of the ship, the captain, prisoners, and slaves. So quite a variety of people. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. They had already put the equipment overboard and some of the cargo overboard, but they kept some of the cargo to have some weight so that the ship wouldn't completely tip over in the wind. But now they want it really to be light so that they can handle it and maybe get it on shore. Now, this storm is really violent, and they're coming to Malta, which we're going to find out later on. In the autumn of 1976, which is about the same time of year as this is taking place, I went on a very large ferry with cars in it and lots of people from Siracusa in southern Sicily to Valletta in Malta, and there was a storm. And the waves were 8 meters, 25 feet high. It was a really violent storm with roaring, howling wind, and I spent most of the time hugging a toilet and turning green. But we got safely to Malta, and I thought a wooden ship the size of Paul's ship, it must have been just horrifying to be in such a storm. And then a couple of days later in Malta, I went to look at St. Paul's Bay, which is a bay that fits the description we're going to read. It has cliffs above it, and there's a sandy beach, and it looks like a great place to land a boat. But as we're going to see, there was a ridge of sand or a shoal out of sight further out that the ship ran aground on. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. As they had tied the rudders so they wouldn't flash back and forth and damage the boat or break off, but now they wanted to use them to steer so that they could go toward this sand. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. If they hoisted this sail in the front, they could, with the force of the wind, guide the ship because the rudders were now movable. But the ship struck a sandbar offshore and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The stern might have been broken partly by the shock of running into this sandbar, and then the surf would have been tremendous because of the storm, would continue breaking up the ship. Verse 42. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping, because Roman soldiers who were responsible for prisoners were in the situation of their life for your life. You have to deliver these prisoners or their dead bodies, or you will be killed, because this is your duty. So they were really afraid that some of the prisoners could swim well and could get ashore, and they wouldn't be able to find them again, and then they would be executed for losing these prisoners. So they thought, well, if we kill them, we'll have their bodies, and we can say, yeah, they tried to escape, we killed them, here are their bodies, and they wouldn't be punished. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life. See, this is once again a true fact, but also evidence for the trial, and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to the land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So next time we'll see what happens to them when they get onto the land. In this passage, we see that God carries out his plans and purposes, sometimes in violent and frightening ways. We can be at peace no matter what kind of storms we go through if we keep our eyes on Jesus and our faith in God. God bless and keep you. Amen.